I've talked about some of this before, but I wanted to bring the ideas together into a single video so you get the bigger picture, and it just puts it into a more recent place. So rain dances were performed to encourage rainfall in a lot of traditional tribes, as well as prayers and fasting and sacrifices. And these were all to appease nature's spirits or gods so that crops and livestock can survive, and to remedy droughts, of course. Man, in many instances, have looked to their behavior as influencing rain. Droughts were blamed on crimes, and rain was seen as gifts for being loyal to the gods, for example. Human emotions are invariably tied with rain as well. Moods and feelings are greatly affected to the point that we sometimes think that the rain is mimicking our own emotional state. And there's sort of an ability or phenomena of humans to be able to make clouds disappear by simply observing them and willing for a cloud to dissipate. And it goes to reason that the reverse is true, that groups of humans can encourage cloud formation and ultimately rainfall. You can test this out yourself by finding a small cloud outside and willing it to disappear. Ancient fermentation rituals run along similar veins. A festival of dancing and music were often performed to encourage the gods of the brew to inoculate their barrels to start the fermentation process. Some cultures believed that solemn quiet was required for fermentation, so you'll see it vary from culture to culture on the exact specifics on how to start fermentation. But they respected the spirits and allowed them to change their water and grains or water and fruit to beer and wine to ferment. Now, this is a remarkable practice of these cultures, and it reveals something about ancient man. But before we get to that, keep in mind that fermentation is one of the reasons humans settled into communities and began farming in the first place. It was so we could brew beer and wine more effectively. You could almost say that the yeast is what domesticated humans. So these two practices of rain and fermentation are inextricably linked in the ancient world. They're also the basis of the so-called fertility cults. To stimulate the sky god into rain, and then to hold a festival in honor of the fermentation gods, that was what fertility cults were all about, and all the in-between things related to those practices. Like with rain, you have bountiful and fertile land, good harvest, and with beer, you have merrymaking and companionship and parties and festivals and celebration, essentially, of those good harvests. But you also have these deeply spiritual experiences, as many psychedelic herbs were included in the brew. It's a source of nutrition and medicine as well. And they relied on those two practices of rain and fermentation for their livelihood. If you were a settled community and you weren't able to grow anything, you would not last very long. That's why humans traveled. That's why we were nomadic. But once we figured out how to more or less guarantee rainfall and fermentation, you could then justify settling in a community, and that's what we saw. So there's a modern experiment on water consciousness that involved multiple jars of rice, each with its own positive or negative label attached to the jar. The experiment goes on to show that crude, smelly, and poisonous mold grows in the negative jars of rice, while more aromatic, clean, and healthier mold grows in the positive jars of rice. This is repeated with not only the labels, but with music and images, verbal affirmations, and even using nothing more than intentions. If you've been following along my work, you probably can already predict what I will say next, that the rice experiment doesn't prove water consciousness at all. Not to say that water isn't conscious, but the experiment indicates fungal intelligence and consciousness. This experiment gives us insight into ancient fermentation rituals where even the slightest bacterial infection could render an entire brew undrinkable. Cultures from around the world learn that their intentions in music and parties, or sometimes meditation, could in fact keep the purity of their fermentation. If there wasn't a solid method to be able to get consistent fermentations, humans wouldn't have settled when or how they did. They needed a surefire way of being able to guarantee that crops would grow and that those crops could then be fermented. But this is all especially impressive because they used nothing more than the naturally occurring yeast in the air or on the fruit and grains. They didn't have packets of yeast starter like we have right now. But over time, they did get something even more interesting. See, some cultures, they pass down magic stirring wands or other sacred instrumentation like the bowls and barrels used to ferment or mix their brews. And this is another example where we see an ancient concept of magic applying directly to fungal interaction, just like how garlic warded off evil disease causing fungal spirits or circles of salt. The Norse, for example, would pass down their brewing wands from generation to generation because mixing with the wand of a successful brew would all but guarantee further success. So what is happening is the wand has a culture of yeast on it that gets transferred and inoculated from brew to brew. It was thought of as magic, as the bowl or the barrel or the wand was learning, had to learn how to brew, and then it would be able to do so again and again. These were equated to with spirits and gods and magic. What we see time and time again is that it's in fact just fungus. But it is the spirits who are really yeast spores that ancient man played the fiddle and danced for, and it is fungi that they beseeched for rain. And fungi, as we have learned, can actually cause rain through the millions and billions of spores in the sky that allow for water molecules to bind and condensate into clouds. Just as they sang for yeast to ferment, ancient man too danced for fungi to create rain. Whether they knew it or not, man has always worshipped fungi and fungal abilities, personifying and zoomorphizing, inventing spiritual metaphors and supernatural explanations for these invisible organisms. I'll talk about the consciousness and intelligence of fungi in a future video, as I want to kind of keep a series of these more shorter and concise summaries of key mythological study and subjects. So this is merely rain, dances, and fermentation. But when you measure the effects of the rice experiment and the power of intention and manifestation to the phenomena of rain and fermentation, and how it is ultimately all tied to fungus, we see very important foundations to the beliefs and religions of mankind. These earliest concepts of God make way for the more complex fungal entities and religions that would later shape human history and give us our most basic perceptions of life and spirituality. Thanks for watching.